I've always had a soft spot for old trucks. There's just something about their character, their history, the way they rumble to life with a deep, satisfying growl that nothing modern can replicate. It's not just a vehicle. It's a piece of the past, a reminder of a time when things were built to last. That's why, a few years ago, I decided to spend my free time restoring a 1967 Ford F-100. It wasn't a showpiece, not by any means, but it was mine. I poured hours, weekends, and more than a few dollars into that truck. I had no interest in buying a new car. My heart was set on bringing this classic back to life. The restoration wasn't an easy task, and it took a lot of time and patience. I remember tracking down parts from scrap yards, carefully stripping the truck down to its bones, and rebuilding it from the ground up. There were moments I thought about giving up, especially when things didn't quite fit or when I'd come across another broken component. But I kept pushing forward. The satisfaction of seeing the truck gradually come together, the fresh coat of paint gleaming under the sun, and the engine purring like a lion. It was all worth it. After years of hard work, the 1967 Ford F-100 became my pride and joy, the vehicle I drove every day. I remember the first time I drove it around the neighborhood after finishing the restoration. The truck didn't just look good. It felt good too. It was powerful, sturdy, and just right. I was proud of it. But little did I know, that truck would soon become the catalyst for one of the most frustrating and bizarre situations I've ever found myself in. That's where Lauren comes in. Lauren wasn't someone I paid much attention to at first. She was just another neighbor, one of those people who would occasionally wave when passing but never really engaged in much conversation. It wasn't until she became the president of our homeowners association, HOA, that I started hearing more about her. To be honest, I didn't care much about HOA politics. I never paid much attention to who was in charge or what their rules were. As long as I could keep my truck in my own driveway, I figured everything would be fine. But Lauren was different. She wasn't like the other members of the HOA. She didn't just want to follow the rules. She wanted to enforce them, and she did so with a zeal that felt borderline obsessive. It didn't take long for her to get a reputation in the neighborhood as someone who thought she was the boss of everyone. You couldn't leave a single piece of lawn furniture out without getting a note from her. You couldn't park a car in front of your own house without it being flagged. She took her role so seriously, it started to feel like she was running a dictatorship rather than a neighborhood association. And that's when the trouble began. One afternoon, I pulled into my driveway after a long day at work, just like I always did. My 1967 Ford F-100 sat there, gleaming in the driveway, its chrome bumpers shining brightly under the late afternoon sun. I was proud of how it looked, and I couldn't wait to show it off at the next neighborhood block party. As I parked and got out, I noticed Lauren standing on her front porch, eyeing the truck. I didn't think much of it at first, but then she started walking toward me, a strange look on her face. "Hey, nice truck," she said in a tone that seemed more critical than complimentary. "But, I don't think it's supposed to be here." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "It's parked in my driveway." She crossed her arms, looking at the truck with disdain. "That thing is a pollution hazard. You can't have a gas-guzzling truck like that in a neighborhood like ours. The HOA rules state that vehicles like that aren't allowed here." I blinked, confused. "What? I've never heard of any rules like that. I've lived here for years, and I've never had a problem." Lauren was adamant. "It's in the bylaws. You should have read them when you moved in. You need to get rid of that truck, or I'll have to take action." I was taken aback. "Are you serious? There's nothing in the HOA rules about banning trucks or cars like mine." "I've checked." She shrugged dismissively. "Maybe you didn't look hard enough. The HOA president has the right to enforce certain standards, and that truck doesn't meet those standards." I could feel my blood starting to boil. "I'm pretty sure there's no rule like that. If there was, I would have known about it." She didn't care about my opinion. "Well, you need to get rid of it. I've already sent warnings to other neighbors with similar vehicles, and if you don't comply, I'll be forced to take further action." I didn't know how to respond to that. I felt completely blindsided. There was no way that a truck like mine could be banned from the neighborhood. I'd been living there for years without any issues, and suddenly, Some new rule popped up out of nowhere. But what could I do? I didn't want to get into a fight with Lauren, and I had other things to deal with. So, I decided to just let it go for the time being, but I knew I had to look into this supposed rule she was talking about. That night, after dinner, I went online and searched the HOA's official website. I combed through the bylaws and regulations, looking for any mention of restrictions on vehicles. After what felt like hours of reading, I found absolutely nothing that said I couldn't have my 1967 Ford F-100 parked in my driveway. There was nothing about gasoline-powered trucks or any other vehicle restrictions. The next morning, I decided to confront Lauren. I walked up to her house, ready to challenge her on her claim. As soon as she saw me, her face hardened. I looked into the rules, I said, and there's nothing in the HOA bylaws that says my truck can't be here. Lauren just smirked. Well, you'll see. I'm in charge here, and I don't want to see that truck in this neighborhood. I knew I couldn't let this go. It wasn't just about the truck. It was about the principle of the matter. How could she just make up rules and expect people to follow them? But before I could say anything more, Lauren cut me off. I'll have to take action if you don't comply, she said coldly. I'll give you a warning this time, but if you don't get rid of it soon, I'll take it further. I left her house with a bad feeling in my gut. I couldn't let her push me around like this. It was my property, my truck, and I had every right to park it in my own driveway. I wasn't going to let Lauren's power trip ruin everything I'd worked for. The following days were tense, but I thought maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, people like Lauren often made a big deal out of nothing. I figured she'd forget about it or move on to some other neighbor to harass. But that was the problem. When you deal with someone like Lauren, you soon realize that they don't let go easily. I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over, and I was right. A few nights later, I came home from work, exhausted from the long day. As I turned the corner and pulled into my driveway, I immediately noticed something was wrong. My 1967 Ford F-100 was gone. I didn't panic at first. Maybe I had parked it somewhere else? Maybe it was towed for some other reason? I quickly checked the street, and my truck was nowhere to be seen. I ran to the front door, hoping to find some kind of note or explanation. Nothing. I checked the driveway again, still nothing. It was at that moment I started to feel the panic set in. I couldn't think of any logical reason why my truck wouldn't be where I left it. Then I found a note. It was from the towing company. My stomach dropped as I read the words, "Vehicle towed at the request of the HOA. Unauthorized vehicle. Fine due." I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was it. Lauren had gone too far. She had actually had my truck towed. In the middle of the night, when I wasn't even around to stop her, she'd taken matters into her own hands and hauled off my 1967 Ford F-100. My heart was racing now, my mind scrambling to figure out how she could justify this. But I already knew. Lauren had no boundaries, and she was getting dangerously comfortable abusing her power. The first thing I did was check the phone number on the towing slip. It wasn't the best time of night to call, but I didn't care. The truck was mine and I needed answers. I dialed the number, hoping for some sort of reasonable explanation. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "Hello, this is Benny's Towing. How can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've got my truck. It's a 1967 Ford F-100. I need it back immediately." "Sorry, sir. We've got an order from the HOA to tow it. They said it was violating neighborhood rules. You'll need to contact them directly for any further details." I clenched my fists. "What rules? There's nothing in the HOA bylaws about my truck. It's parked in my driveway." "Sorry, sir. I can't help you with that. You'll need to talk to the HOA. If you want the truck back, you'll have to pay the fees and follow the HOA's instructions." I was furious. I wasn't just dealing with some rogue tow company. I was dealing with Lauren, who was hiding behind her position to make ridiculous, unauthorized decisions. My 1967 Ford F-100 was more than just a vehicle to me. It was the culmination of years of work and dedication. And now, because of some power-hungry HOA president, it was gone. I wasn't going to let this slide. I needed to get it back, and I needed to make sure Lauren understood the consequences of her actions. The next morning, I marched straight to the HOA office. It was a short walk, but every step felt like an eternity. My blood was boiling, and I knew I couldn't leave until I got answers. I arrived at the office, and there was Lauren, sitting behind her desk, looking as smug as ever. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "I need my truck back," I said firmly. Lauren finally looked up, feigning surprise. "Oh, I was wondering when you'd show up. I told you to get rid of that truck. It's a hazard." I could feel the anger rising inside me. "It's not a hazard. There's nothing in the rules that says it can't be here. You had no right to tow my truck, Lauren." She shrugged, as if dismissing my frustration. "I've told you before. The rules are clear. We can't have vehicles like that here. You've had multiple warnings. You don't listen. It's on you." "No," I shot back, "it's on you. You can't just make up rules and enforce them as if they're real. I've checked the bylaws. There's nothing in there that bans my truck, and you know it." She leaned back in her chair, looking unconcerned. "Well, I had the truck towed anyway. I'm within my rights. You'll have to pay the towing fees, and I'll be issuing a fine for the violation." I stood there, speechless for a moment. My car was being treated like some sort of criminal, and I was being asked to pay the price for Lauren's twisted idea of what was acceptable in the neighborhood. "I'm not paying any fine," I finally said, my voice shaking with frustration. "I want my truck back, and I'm not paying for your mistake." Lauren's expression didn't change. "Well, you'll have to talk to the towing company then. If you don't like it, I'll be happy to issue you a fine for wasting my time." It was clear that Lauren wasn't going to back down, and neither was I. She had already made her decision, and now it was up to me to fight back. But the situation was more than just about my truck. It was about principle. Lauren was abusing her position as HOA president, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I left her office, determined to take the next step. I immediately contacted a lawyer. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. The towing was illegal, and the fine was completely unjustified. The next move was clear. I had to take action, or else Lauren would keep pulling stunts like this. My truck wasn't just a vehicle to me. It was a symbol of everything I'd worked for, and I wasn't about to let it be taken away by someone who thought they were above the law. The phone call with my lawyer was a relief, though it was clear I was facing a lengthy and expensive fight. The legal process would take time, but at least now I knew I wasn't alone in this. The lawyer immediately began preparing for what would become a much bigger ordeal than I had initially expected. We had the law on our side, and I had proof that Lauren's actions were not only over the top but illegal. The first step was to formally demand the return of my truck. My lawyer sent a letter to the HOA, giving them a deadline to return the truck and to cancel the fine. The letter clearly outlined how the towing had been illegal and how Lauren had overstepped her authority. I wasn't just fighting for my truck. I was fighting to show Lauren that she couldn't get away with making up rules and enforcing them with no legal basis. The letter also made it clear that if they didn't comply, we would file a lawsuit. First, I thought Lauren would back down, but that was wishful thinking. She had no intention of admitting fault. I could already see it coming. She was going to dig in her heels and refuse to accept any responsibility for what had happened. And that's exactly what she did. The HOA lawyer responded, saying that they weren't going to return the truck or revoke the fine. Lauren stuck to her story, claiming that she had every right to have my truck towed because the HOA rules prohibited vehicles like mine. At this point, my lawyer advised me to file the paperwork for a lawsuit. I didn't want to go to court. I didn't want to drag this out any longer than necessary. But it seemed like Lauren was forcing my hand. So we filed a formal lawsuit against her and the HOA. It wasn't just about getting my truck back anymore. It was about holding Lauren accountable for her abuse of power. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew one thing for certain. I was ready for a fight. I had spent enough time working on that truck, pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into it. I wasn't about to let Lauren take it from me without a fight. My lawyer was ready, and we had the evidence to back up our case. But I didn't expect Lauren to be as combative as she was. The courtroom was packed with the usual crowd. Other HOA members, a few neighbors, and even a couple of random onlookers. Lauren was sitting in her seat, looking entirely too comfortable, as if she already thought she had one. The judge called the court to order and we all stood. When we were seated, the lawyer for the HOA stood up first and started his opening remarks. He didn't have much of a case, to be honest. He kept repeating the same vague claims that Lauren had the authority to make decisions about the neighborhood, but he never once referenced an actual law or regulation that would back up her actions. The judge looked unimpressed, clearly not buying any of it. When my lawyer took the floor, things started to get interesting. Your Honor, my lawyer began, this case involves a clear violation of rights. The HOA president, Ms. Lauren, unlawfully had the plaintiff's vehicle towed without cause or justification. There is no HOA law in existence that bans the truck in question. Furthermore, there's no record of the fine imposed by the HOA, and Ms. Lauren cannot provide any documentation to back her claims. Lauren didn't look so confident anymore. She sat up straighter, but her eyes were darting around nervously. She knew the case wasn't looking good for her, but she wasn't going to back down easily. The judge turned to Lauren, signaling her to speak. Lauren stood up, her voice shaky but still carrying a sense of authority. Your Honor, I followed HOA regulations. Our rules don't allow vehicles like that in the neighborhood. I had asked the plaintiff multiple times to get rid of the truck before I took any action. It's a safety issue. I made the decision to tow it because the rules clearly state that we can't have such vehicles here. The judge raised an eyebrow. Ms. Lauren, I've reviewed the HOA's bylaws, and there's no mention of such a rule prohibiting vehicles like this one. In fact, there's no rule at all that addresses this issue. Can you provide any formal documentation or bylaws to support your claim? Lauren faltered for a moment before responding. Well, there's a general understanding among the board members that older trucks are a nuisance and should not be allowed. We didn't think it needed to be formalized. The judge's expression hardened. That's not how rules are made, Ms. Lauren. If you're going to enforce something, there has to be a documented rule. Without that, you have no authority to impose fines or order towing. Lauren tried to recover. I asked him multiple times to remove the truck. It was causing disturbances in the neighborhood. The judge looked at her incredulously. You asked him? What exactly did you ask him? And when? Lauren seemed caught off guard by the question. I spoke to him several times. I told him that his truck was a problem. Can you provide any evidence of this? The judge asked. Lauren hesitated again. No, but I made it clear that it needed to go. Ms. Lauren, the judge said sternly, this is not how a homeowners association operates. You can't just make up rules based on personal preference or vague notions of what's acceptable. There's a process for creating and enforcing HOA rules, and none of that was followed here. At this point, it was clear that the judge was not buying Lauren's arguments. He turned to the lawyer for the HOA. The towing was unauthorized, and the fine was not only baseless but illegal. Ms. Lauren, I'm afraid you've violated the plaintiff's rights and overstepped your authority. Lauren's face reddened, but she didn't have a response. The judge went on, detailing how she had failed to follow proper procedures, how the towing had no legal basis, and how her personal preferences couldn't override the law. He also mentioned that she had imposed a fine without any justification, a violation of both the law and HOA protocols. The judge didn't hesitate. He ordered that the 1967 Ford F-100 be returned to me immediately and that the fine be canceled. But the judge didn't stop there. He also turned to Lauren and informed her that, based on her misconduct, she would be held financially responsible for the legal fees I had incurred. The court ruled that Lauren was to pay for all of my attorney's fees, as well as the costs associated with retrieving my truck from the towing company. The courtroom fell silent as the judge made his final remarks. Lauren sat there, pale and defeated, as the reality of the situation sank in. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but I couldn't help but notice how utterly embarrassed Lauren looked. She had tried to use her position to bully me, and it had backfired spectacularly. The judge's words were clear. She had overstepped her authority, violated HOA rules, and was now facing the consequences. It was a strange feeling to finally have the legal battle behind me. I was relieved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Lauren's downfall had been inevitable. She had built herself up in her own mind as the queen of the neighborhood, but in reality, she was a small-minded bully with too much power and too little regard for the people she was supposed to serve. Watching her face as the judge handed down his verdict was something I would never forget. It was the look of someone who realized they had made a monumental mistake. She had underestimated me, and now the consequences were irreversible. The moment I got home, I immediately called the towing company. To my surprise, they had already received the court order to return my truck. The 1967 Ford F-100 was finally back in my driveway where it belonged. I had feared the worst, that the truck might have suffered damage during its time in the tow yard. But when I saw it, I knew I had gotten lucky. It was in surprisingly good condition, considering the circumstances. I made a mental note to never take it for granted again. As for Lauren, well, things didn't go nearly as smoothly for her. The repercussions of her actions went far beyond just the courtroom. The HOA was under intense scrutiny. In fact, after the case, many of the neighbors began questioning the HOA's practices. People started to realize how much power someone like Lauren had abused in her position. Some of them had been too intimidated to speak out before, but now, they were starting to come forward with their own stories of unfair fines and questionable decisions made by Lauren. The floodgates opened. The final blow came a few weeks after the court ruling. A meeting was scheduled by the HOA board to discuss the aftermath of Lauren's actions. It was clear that the other board members had been in a state of denial for far too long. They had allowed her to make unilateral decisions and intimidate others because they were either too scared to challenge her or too complacent to care. But now that Lauren had been publicly humiliated in court, their hands were forced. I wasn't in attendance at that meeting, but I heard from neighbors afterward that it didn't go well for Lauren. The board had no choice but to ask her to step down from her position as president. In the end, she resigned with no fanfare, no apology, and no explanation. The neighbors didn't care about her so-called personal time or her claims of stepping down for the good of the neighborhood. The truth was clear. Lauren had been caught red-handed, and her reign of terror was over. The aftermath didn't stop with just the HOA. Lauren was also slapped with the financial consequences of her actions. The judge's decision to make her cover my legal fees was only the beginning. The HOA had no choice but to conduct an audit of all the fines she had imposed during her time in power. It wasn't long before they discovered more illegal fines she had levied against other residents, as well as questionable tactics she had used to intimidate people into paying up. Lauren was forced to pay for all of the fines she had wrongly imposed, and she was also ordered to reimburse the homeowners for the unnecessary costs they had incurred due to her misconduct. The HOA board, now fully aware of her abuse, voted to permanently ban her from holding any position within the organization. It was a humiliating blow to her ego, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction knowing that she had gotten exactly what she deserved. I didn't want to gloat about her downfall, but it was hard not to. She had tried to take my truck away from me, to rob me of something I had worked so hard for, and she had used her position to bully me. In the end, it was Lauren who had to pay for her actions. Her reputation in the neighborhood was completely tarnished. No one trusted her anymore, and even those who had once supported her began to distance themselves. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. My truck was back where it belonged, and I could finally get back to doing what I loved, driving it around, taking care of it, and enjoying the freedom that came with it. But the experience had left me a little more cynical. I had learned that there were people out there willing to use their power for personal gain, to exploit others for their own sense of control. It was a wake-up call, and I wasn't going to let it go. The neighborhood changed after Lauren's departure. People became more involved in the HOA's activities, and there was a renewed sense of community. The board was more accountable, and it was clear that they weren't going to let any one person take over again. But most importantly, people were no longer afraid to stand up to injustice. Lauren's downfall had shown us all that sometimes standing up for what's right could make a real difference. In the end, I had won not just the battle for my truck, but a victory over someone who thought they could take it all away. And that felt pretty damn good.